12. Everyday foods sitting in your kitchen are rising in price so quickly that many families are already starting to quietly adjust the way they eat. Most people don't even realize this shift is happening yet. And it's not the obvious items like beef or coffee. We're talking about the basics people rarely think twice about: rice, oats, cooking oil, canned tomatoes, and other pantry staples you usually toss into your cart without checking the cost. That whole group of everyday essentials is changing all at once right now. What really stands out is number 7 on this list. It completely caught my attention. It's a food that was once discovered in an ancient Egyptian tomb, still perfectly safe to eat even after thousands of years. A food so durable it was considered almost impossible to destroy. And yet today, that same item has become one of the most unstable and unpredictable parts of the entire global food system. Surprisingly, the problem has nothing to do with the food itself. Here are all 12 items. You'll probably want to see this before your next trip to the grocery store. Number 12. Beef Thomas is 68 years old, and for the last 2 decades he has had a simple Sunday tradition. He takes his grandson to the grocery store. The boy usually chooses the cereal, while Thomas heads straight for the meat section. That was just how their routine worked every week. But last month, something shifted. Thomas picked up a pack of ground beef, flipped it over to check the price, then quietly placed it back on the shelf. His grandson looked up at him and asked, "Grandpa, I thought we were going to make burgers." Without stopping, Thomas just pushed the cart forward and replied that they'd figure something else out. Later, he admitted he didn't want to get into it. He just couldn't justify it anymore. Not long ago, ground beef in the US averaged around $6 per pound in many stores. By 2026, that figure had surged to roughly $9 to $10 per pound nationally, marking an increase of about 50%, and prices are still trending upward. A lot of people still assume it's a short-term jump, but the reality is far more structural. It begins with the land itself. In cattle-producing states like Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma, long-lasting drought conditions have been damaging grazing pastures faster than they can recover. As a result, ranchers are forced to rely more on expensive supplemental feed while also dealing with rising costs for corn, fuel, water, and labor. To survive financially, many have had no choice but to shrink their herds. This has led to a major decline in livestock numbers. The U.S. cattle and calf population has dropped to around 86 million, the lowest it has been in roughly 75 years. What makes that figure especially important is the timing. Raising a calf to full market weight takes years, meaning supply cannot rebound quickly. Even if weather conditions improved immediately, it would still take years, not months, for production to recover. Thomas's Sunday tradition has already changed, and given the current situation, it may not be returning to what it once was for a long time. Number 11. Oats. This is where things start to get a bit uncomfortable. When beef prices rise, people usually find ways to adjust. They switch to other proteins, change habits, or cut back a little. It's annoying, but not exactly surprising anymore. What caught people off guard was something much more basic: oats. Margaret is 73 years old. For more than 20 years, she has bought the same large container of oats from the same shelf in the same store. She never once thought about the price. It was just one of those steady, reliable groceries you grab without a second thought. But last week, she found herself standing in the aisle, actually comparing price per ounce across 3 different brands. That evening, she told her daughter about it. Her daughter brushed it off, saying, "Mom, it's just oatmeal." Margaret replied quietly, "That's exactly what I used to think too." Oats were always considered one of those completely safe, low-cost staples, something dependable and affordable no matter what. But that perception has started to change. 2 things are driving it. First, supply has tightened. In key growing regions, drought conditions and unstable weather patterns have reduced crop yields, while at the same time processing and transportation costs have continued to climb. Then there's the demand side. The health food industry has turned oats into a high-value ingredient. They're now used in granola, oat milk, protein bars, and other premium products where buyers are willing to pay more. That means budget shoppers are now competing directly with higher-margin industries for the same raw crop. So you end up with pressure coming from both sides. Less supply and more demand at the same time. When something as simple and cheap as oats starts requiring a second thought at the store, it says a lot about how widespread this cost pressure has become. Beef was the early warning. Oats are the confirmation. Number 10. Coffee. Coffee is a completely different kind of issue. When beef gets expensive, people switch to other proteins. When oats go up, they start comparing brands and prices more carefully. But with coffee, something different happens. People notice the higher price, maybe sigh a little, and still toss it into the cart anyway. Every single time. That can't-quit-it behavior is exactly what makes coffee unique. Demand barely shifts, even when prices rise sharply. And rise they have. By early 2026, the average retail price for roasted ground coffee reached about $9.72 per pound, the highest level ever recorded since data tracking began in 1980. This wasn't a slow, steady increase. It was a full reset in how the entire category is priced. The pressure comes mainly from two countries that essentially anchor global supply: Brazil, the largest producer and dominant source of Arabica beans, and Vietnam, the top producer of Robusta, which is widely used in instant coffee and cheaper blends. Both regions have been hit at the same time. In Brazil, prolonged droughts, unexpected frosts, and irregular rainfall have damaged crops over several growing seasons. Coffee plants don't recover quickly either, so the effects stack up year after year. As a result, Arabica futures surged by roughly 70% through 2024. Shortly after, Vietnam's Robusta production also came under pressure due to its own weather-related disruptions. What makes this situation especially important is that it's not limited to high-end coffee. The cost increases are hitting everything: store brands, budget bags, and even instant coffee. There's essentially no lower tier left to downgrade to. Most people will continue drinking coffee every day. That habit isn't going away. But over time, the price of that daily cup just keeps inching upward, with fewer and fewer ways to escape the increase. Number 9. Pasta. There used to be a time when pasta was the easiest solution to almost any problem. Low budget? Pasta. Fridge almost empty? Pasta. No plan and it's already evening? Still pasta. It was the one go-to answer for just about everything. David has 3 children and usually handles most of the grocery shopping for the household. For years, pasta was something he never even thought about in terms of price. It simply went into the cart without hesitation, he explained. But recently, he's noticed a change in himself. Now he actually stops at that aisle, looks at unit pricing, and reads labels he used to ignore completely. Even he found it strange. He said, "I don't know exactly when it started, but it definitely wasn't like this before." On the surface, pasta still gives the impression of being one of the cheapest foods you can buy. But behind each box, the cost structure has been steadily shifting. The main driver is wheat, the core ingredient. It has been under ongoing pressure from extreme weather patterns, higher fertilizer costs, more expensive fuel, and disruptions in global transportation. On top of that, there are additional costs built into every stage: milling, drying, packaging, factory operations, and shipping. Each layer adds pressure, and by the time it reaches the shelf, all of it is reflected in the final price. What makes pasta especially sensitive is when people buy it. Families often turn to it specifically when money is tight. So when more households start reaching for it at the same time, demand increases just as budgets are tightening, pushing prices up right when people are relying on it the most. That thin margin that once made pasta feel almost endlessly affordable has been slowly shrinking. And the households that depended on that affordability the most are usually the first to feel the change. Number 8. Dry beans. There's a familiar pattern that shows up whenever food prices start climbing in a noticeable way. People who never really paid attention to the dry beans aisle suddenly begin to take a much closer look at it. Evelyn is a retired school teacher who prefers shopping on quiet Wednesday mornings. Not long ago, she found herself standing in front of the meat section with a pack of ground beef in one hand, then glancing over at the nearby shelves lined with dried beans. After a moment, she made a decision. She put 4 bags of beans in her cart and left the beef behind. The shopper next to her seemed surprised, so Evelyn broke it down in simple terms. 1 bag of beans, once soaked and cooked, can stretch into several family meals. The beef, on the other hand, would cover just a single dinner. For her, it wasn't about preference, it was basic math. A standard 1-pound bag of dry beans, when prepared properly, can produce roughly 10 to 12 servings. It delivers a strong mix of plant-based protein and fiber at a cost per serving that very few other grocery items can match. What's happening now is that more and more families are quietly relearning this same calculation. As prices for beef, chicken, and other animal proteins continue to rise, demand for dried legumes is increasing alongside them. A food that has always been cheap is now being actively chosen again. And like anything else, rising demand eventually influences price. One of the advantages of dry beans is how practical they are. They don't need refrigeration or freezing. When stored properly in airtight containers and kept dry, they can stay usable and nutritious for years. They also combine easily with rice, canned tomatoes, spices, and vegetables, turning into complete filling meals at a very low cost. The irony is that beans have always been overlooked for the same reason they are becoming important now. They sit quietly on the bottom shelf with no marketing, no branding, and no hype. Just steady, reliable value. And in a moment where almost everything else on this list is shifting upward, that kind of quiet consistency suddenly stands out more than ever. Number 7. Honey. This is the item that really shifted how I started looking at the whole situation. There are very few foods that seem untouched by history itself, and honey is probably the best example of that. Archaeologists have actually found jars of honey inside ancient Egyptian tombs, sealed for thousands of years, and it was still perfectly preserved and technically edible. In the right conditions, honey has what's basically an indefinite shelf life, which makes the question around it even harder to ignore. If honey can last thousands of years without going bad, why has it become one of the most unpredictable and price-sensitive products in today's food system? The strange part is that the issue has nothing to do with honey as a food. A woman at a local farmer's market recently picked up a jar of raw, local honey. She checked the price, hesitated, and slowly placed it back on the table. Then she tried a cheaper blended option instead, reading the label carefully, but still didn't feel certain about it. In the end, she walked away without buying either. She told the vendor, "I don't even know what I'm looking at anymore." That kind of confusion is becoming more common, and it reflects a market that's under real pressure. In the United States, prices for pure honey have been rising steadily, especially for local and raw varieties. At the same time, store shelves have become filled with blended or imported products where the origin isn't always obvious, and the labeling can be difficult for consumers to interpret without careful attention. Behind all of this is a deeper issue: declining bee colony health. Extreme weather patterns, parasites, loss of natural habitats, and the rising costs of maintaining commercial hives have all combined to reduce overall honey production. As a result, output has become less stable, costs have increased, and prices have followed. But the most important part of this story goes beyond honey itself. Bees don't just produce honey, they are essential pollinators for crops like fruits, vegetables, nuts, and many other staples in the food supply. A large portion of agriculture depends directly on healthy bee populations. So when bee colonies decline, it's not just a honey problem. It becomes a warning sign about the stability of the wider food system itself. Something that once seemed completely immune to time is now being disrupted by pressures happening in the present moment. Number 6. Olive oil. After something as ancient and structurally important as honey, it makes sense to shift back to something much more familiar. Something that feels everyday, simple, and deeply tied to home cooking. Olive oil used to be exactly that. Patricia is 71 years old, and for as long as she can remember, olive oil has been part of her daily routine. She uses it in salads, in the pan before cooking vegetables, and drizzled over pasta. It was never something she thought about in terms of cost. It was just part of how she cooked. But recently, that relationship has started to change. Last month, she was in a supermarket holding a mid-range bottle of extra virgin olive oil, priced close to $25. She paused, remembering that she used to pay around $10 for what felt like the same product. She ended up buying the smallest bottle available, not because she wanted less, but because something that once felt automatic and effortless had started to feel like something she needed to consciously control. That quiet shift, from routine use to careful rationing, is now happening in kitchens across many households. Before 2022, extra virgin olive oil commonly sold in the $10 to $12 range for standard bottles. Today, those same products often sit between $18 and $25, with some premium varieties more than doubling compared to their earlier prices. The reasons trace back to the Mediterranean region, where the majority of the world's olive oil is produced, mainly Spain, Italy, and Greece. All three have been hit by the same overlapping conditions: extreme summer heat, prolonged drought, and consistently low rainfall across multiple growing seasons. Olive trees are hardy and can survive dry climates better than many crops, but they still have limits. When intense heat and long-term lack of soil moisture combine over several years, the result is smaller harvests, fewer olives, and a much lower oil yield overall. So production falls, and in some years, it falls sharply. And unlike many crops, olive trees don't recover quickly. It can take years of stable conditions for yields to return to normal levels. If weather patterns in the Mediterranean don't improve significantly, prices are unlikely to move back to where they once were anytime soon. Patricia still uses olive oil. The difference now is subtle but noticeable. She pours it more carefully than she used to, even if she doesn't always catch herself doing it. Number 5. Canned tomatoes. Some foods rarely get the recognition they actually deserve in a kitchen. They are not the highlight of the meal, nobody really takes photos of them, and no one plans dinner around them. Instead, they quietly hold everything together without being noticed, until they're suddenly missing. Canned tomatoes are exactly that kind of ingredient. Imagine a simple Wednesday evening. There's a bit of ground meat in the fridge, pasta in the cupboard, and a few basic spices on the shelf. On their own, none of it really feels like a complete meal, just separate ingredients waiting for direction. Then you open a can of crushed tomatoes. In an instant, everything changes. It becomes a sauce, a base for chili, or a quick soup, something warm, structured, and enough to feed everyone at the table. For years, canned tomatoes were one of the cheapest items in any grocery store. Many cans cost around $1, or even less. Families bought them without thinking, just a reliable staple that always made sense to keep on hand. But that has started to shift. Today, prices are more commonly sitting between about $1.50 and nearly $2 per can, depending on the brand and location. On the surface, that increase might not look dramatic, but for households that cook often and depend on this ingredient regularly, those small jumps start to add up over the course of a month. The pressure behind this comes largely from California, the main hub for processed tomato production in the United States. Over recent years, the region has faced persistent drought conditions, stricter water limits for irrigation, and repeated extreme heat events, all of which have made growing conditions increasingly unstable. At the same time, other costs have also climbed: steel for cans, energy used in processing, transportation, and labor. These increases are happening all at once, stacking on top of each other. Canned tomatoes don't usually make headlines or appear in inflation charts next to things like beef or fuel. Instead, they just slowly become a little more expensive over time, one can at a time, one shopping trip after another. And often, it's only when someone gets home and looks at the receipt that they realize something has changed, even if they can't immediately explain what it is. The quiet essentials are usually the last ones people notice shifting. Number 4. Spices. There's something almost nobody talks about when food prices come up, and it isn't calories, protein, or even how long something lasts. It's flavor. Because when household budgets get tighter month after month, the first things usually stay the same. You still have rice, you still have beans, you still have pasta. Technically, everyone is fed and nutritional needs are met. But after a while, something changes in a quieter way. Dinner becomes the same set of ingredients over and over again, cooked in nearly identical ways, tasting the same night after night. After the 12th or 15th repetition, it stops feeling like a meal people look forward to and starts feeling like something they just have to get through. That shift is more important than it sounds. Because when eating stops being enjoyable, food is no longer just fuel. It becomes a routine obligation. That's when the small jars sitting at the back of the spice cabinet suddenly take on a different role. They stop being simple seasonings and start becoming what actually holds the entire eating experience together. Black pepper, garlic powder, paprika, cinnamon, oregano, thyme. None of these are considered luxury items. Yet they are what separate a meal that feels satisfying from one that just feels tolerable. And this category is quietly under pressure in ways most people don't notice. Black pepper is largely sourced through Vietnam. A big share of global spice production comes from India. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and many tropical spices are grown in regions like Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia. Before a small jar of paprika ever reaches a supermarket shelf, it has already passed through a long chain. Multiple growing seasons, harvesting, drying, processing, packaging, ocean freight, and several layers of domestic distribution. That supply chain is long, and every single step in it has become more expensive. Extreme heat and inconsistent rainfall in key growing regions have reduced yields. At the same time, fuel costs, shipping rates, and packaging expenses have all increased. But instead of one obvious price spike, what happens here is much more subtle. Prices creep upward across the entire category. A little added here, a smaller jar there, slow adjustments that don't immediately stand out. Over time, making food that actually tastes good becomes noticeably more expensive. Spices rarely appear in food security discussions or economic reports, but they influence something very real. Whether a meal is genuinely enjoyed or simply eaten in silence because there's no alternative. Number 3. Powdered milk. Most people treat preparedness like something they'll get to eventually, almost the same way they think about booking a dentist appointment. They know it matters, they plan to handle it at some point, and then everyday life gets in the way. Until suddenly it's no longer a plan. It's the reality they're dealing with using whatever is already in the house. Carol is raising 2 young grandchildren, and she always keeps a large container of powdered milk in her kitchen cabinet. She doesn't wait until it runs out to replace it. She replaces it ahead of time, just to be safe. When a neighbor asked her why she goes to that effort, her answer was straightforward. Because I sleep better knowing it's there. It wasn't emotional or dramatic, just practical peace of mind. And that practicality highlights something people often underestimate. Powdered milk is one of the most nutritionally complete and shelf-stable foods an average household can store. One container can produce dozens of servings, offering protein and calcium that are especially important for children and older adults, the two groups that often rely most on consistent nutrition and have the fewest easy alternatives when fresh food isn't available. It doesn't require refrigeration, and it doesn't depend on electricity. When sealed properly and kept in a cool, dry place, it can maintain quality for a long time without any special conditions. But even a product like this isn't immune to broader cost pressures. Rising prices for animal feed, higher energy costs involved in drying and processing, and increased expenses for packaging and transportation have all gradually pushed retail prices upward. The pattern is familiar at this point. Either higher prices, smaller quantities, or a combination of both, with most of the cost absorbed before the product even reaches the shelf. What makes powdered milk especially worth noticing isn't that it's at risk of disappearing. It's the role it quietly plays in the background. Long shelf life, high nutritional value per serving, low cost relative to what it provides, and complete independence from refrigeration. Carol sleeps better knowing she has it on hand. And for many families, that kind of quiet reliability is more important than it might seem at first glance. Number 2. Cooking oil. Picture this. You come home after a long day, open the fridge, and you've got eggs, some vegetables, maybe leftover rice. Everything for a quick, simple dinner is sitting right in front of you. Then you reach for the cooking oil and realize the bottle is empty. Nothing about the ingredients has changed, but suddenly the whole meal falls apart. You can't stir-fry. Sautéing becomes complicated. Even something as basic as a fried egg, the most forgiving, effortless meal, turns into a challenge without the one thing that makes it all work. Cooking oil is never the star of the meal. Nobody takes photos of it, and no one thinks about it while eating. But it's the hidden foundation that makes cooking possible in the first place. It's what turns separate ingredients into something that actually becomes dinner. Right now, that foundation is under pressure from multiple sides. Palm oil production is heavily concentrated in Southeast Asia, where it is vulnerable to weather changes and shifts in land use. Soybean oil is tied to agricultural conditions across North and South America and also competes with livestock feed production for the same crops. Sunflower oil, once a widely available and affordable option, was heavily disrupted after instability in the Black Sea region removed a major export source almost overnight. And then there's another factor that often gets overlooked. A growing portion of global vegetable oil is now being diverted into biodiesel production. In other words, the food system is increasingly competing directly with the energy sector for the same raw materials. When energy demand rises, that competition intensifies, and food prices tend to follow. What most people don't see is how far that impact spreads. A rise in cooking oil prices doesn't stay limited to one shelf in the grocery store. It flows into bread, crackers, sauces, dressings, frozen meals, fast food, and a wide range of processed foods where oil is used as a basic ingredient. So when you notice a higher price on a single bottle, you're really only seeing a small piece of a much larger shift happening across your entire grocery cart. Cooking oil is one of those items people only think about when it's almost gone. But in reality, it sits at the center of far more than most people realize. Number 1. Rice. There are foods that feed populations, and then there is rice, the one ingredient that has quietly supported more than half of the world's population for thousands of years. It's not just a staple in the usual sense. It's the baseline that billions of daily meals are built on. A head chef at a small, family-run restaurant once told me something that has stayed with me ever since. He said that if he runs out of any protein on the menu, he can adjust. He can substitute ingredients, rewrite dishes, and keep the kitchen moving without much disruption. But if he runs out of rice, everything stops. The entire menu has to be rethought from the ground up, and that's just one small restaurant. Multiply that kind of dependency across billions of households worldwide, and the scale becomes clear. What many people in the United States don't always realize is how globally connected the rice supply actually is. It doesn't exist in isolation. It depends heavily on production and policy decisions across major exporting countries like Thailand, Vietnam, India, and others. When a major producer experiences a poor harvest or decides to restrict exports for domestic stability, global prices can shift in a matter of weeks, not gradually over time. In recent years, factors like El Niño weather patterns, prolonged regional droughts, and heat stress in key growing regions have all added steady pressure to supply. At the same time, global demand hasn't slowed down. It has continued to rise. It's also important to understand what's actually reflected in the price of a bag of rice on a store shelf. It isn't just the cost of growing the crop. It includes fertilizer, fuel for machinery and transport, storage systems, milling, packaging, and the international shipping networks that move bulk goods around the world. When all of those inputs rise at the same time, even rice, one of the most historically stable food prices, starts to shift in ways that would have been hard to imagine a decade ago. Rice also has a unique pressure point that sets it apart from everything else on this list. In times of financial strain, it is often the very first food families turn to. It's filling, affordable, and adaptable, stretching a grocery budget further than almost anything else available. But that role as the last reliable fallback creates a contradiction. Demand rises exactly when supply is under the most stress. That imbalance doesn't